I'm John Batchelor. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com is here with me, and we're watching the President of the United States insist upon a battle plan with the Islamic State soon enough from the national security apparatus. The Islamic State suddenly is in everybody's gun sights. We're joined by Cleo Pascal, Associate Fellow at Chatham House and author of Global Warming, How Environment, Economic, and Political Crises Will Redraw the World Map. Let's stay with the subcontinent. Cleo, very good evening to you. What can you tell us about the Islamic State and recruiting in the subcontinent, especially the Muslim population of India?
Well, for the last 10 years under the previous administration in India, there was a very soft approach to extremism within India for two main reasons. One was vote bank politics. The Congress Party was depending heavily on the Muslim vote, and in their wisdom, so to speak, they decided that that would mean going very lightly when it came to extremists, even though that put the larger Muslim population at risk. And the other reason is because corrupt politicians within India during that administration were washing their dirty money through Hawala networks, which brought them into relatively direct contact with global terrorist networks. So for the last 10 years, there really hasn't been any proper cracking down or monitoring of what was going on within India, and now that is bearing a very bitter fruit within the country.
Cleo, it's nothing like a death to really change people's perceptions. There's been an American who's been killed fighting with ISIS, and now apparently there's an Indian national fighting with ISIS who's been killed, and this has brought everything to the attention of the Indian populace. If you could talk a little bit about this, because it seems to me this is the story now in India about the Islamic State.
It is, and it was a big surprise because for many years, the Indians thought of themselves as the kind of recipients of terror coming in through Pakistan and other places. But now there's very clearly recruiting going on, and the result is young men and educated young men. There's the current batch of 4 that we know about. 3 of them were in engineering university when they went off to go fight in Syria. One of them, as you say, was just killed today or yesterday. The news came out. So it's really concentrating the mind within India about what's been happening within the country and how bad the situation has become over the last 10 years.
The puzzle about the subcontinent in general is that the partition wars led to 1 million casualties, and the creation of Pakistan, which is a natural problem for the United States, Afghanistan, all these years. But the Islamic State, is there something new here, or is this just the traditional rally to go to jihad that we've been seeing for decades in the subcontinent?
The different factor here for India is this is not just trans-border, this is no border. So Pakistan might be a Muslim state, but it's still a state. Whereas the Islamic State is basically saying everything should be Islamic. All these existing borders should be obliterated. So what Prime Minister Modi of India has said, for example, is, I don't care what religion you are, as long as you are a patriotic Indian. And increasingly we're seeing within the community those who don't feel they're Indian first. They feel like they're Sunni first, for example, or Wahhabi first, or however they want to define it. In which case that threatens the very legitimacy of the state itself. So it's an entirely new and extremely dangerous metastasizing of the issue.
And certainly for India, where you have, the world's second largest Muslim population, although
it's 157 million Muslims in India, about 17% are Shia, and most of the rest are Sunni.
So you have a predominantly Hindu state. I know it's still very early days, but do the Hindus in India feel threatened that this ISIS might actually come to India and inflame relations between the Muslims and the Hindus?
Yeah, and it's the tip of a very large iceberg, because a lot of the recruiting is happening of Indians that are working in Saudi and Qatar, for example, primarily. So they're people who might be doctors or engineers or drivers or whomever who are working in those countries. They get radicalized in those countries, they get funding, and then they go back to India to do the recruiting within India. So this kind of trans-border international jihad component of it is extremely disturbing. Now, what you're talking about is this important ISIS component, but what you also see is, for example, in the shopping malls in some of the areas in the last 10 years, it's a visible change with the amount of women going in full facial covering now. We hardly saw it 10 years ago. Now we're seeing it increasingly. And it's part of the same phenomena.
Implicit in what you're saying, Cleo, if I read this correctly, is that this would be a very unhappy way of explaining Mr. Modi's overwhelming success at the polls and the ousting of the Congress Party and the domination of a party that's entirely identified with Hindu nationalism, extreme Hindu nationalism, almost as if there was an anticipation that there would be a reawakening of the Takfiri jihadists, who are the Islamic State, which is apocalyptic and extreme violence, and sees a Hindu in much the same light as you see an American, an infidel to be converted or destroyed. Did Mr. Modi win because this was already in the water?
That was one component of it. The thing that allowed this to happen, allowed this flourishing of extremism within the country, was corruption. So those two twinned things, this flourishing of extremism and the corruption of the Congress Party, were the two things that he was very clearly against. And you'll see, by the way, a lot of funding coming out of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to try to discredit Modi, especially within the next year in the U.S., in the media, in the think tanks, to try to paint him as an extremist, as a Hindu extremist, as a kind of an equivalent to a Muslim extremist, in order to try to discredit him and isolate him. He is not. He is an anti-corruption campaigner who is fundamentally a nationalist who happens to be Hindu.
So, Cleo, essentially what you're saying is that for Modi to win this ideological religious struggle, he's going to have to not only engage in a battle of ideas, he's also going to have to clean up corruption, which has been inherent in the Indian government. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. And it goes beyond that. I'm not sure if you're aware, but India has separate civil codes for the different religions.
We have 30 seconds, Cleo. Go ahead.
Okay, so for example, if you're a Muslim in India, you can have 4 wives. If you're Hindu, you can only have 1. So those sorts of disparities within the system have to start to change.
Cleo, yes, that would strike me as a profound distinction that needed to change. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com, and we thank Cleo Pascal, an associate fellow at Chatham House, author of Global Warring, How Environmental, Economic, and Political Crises Will Redraw the World Map. I'm John Batchelor.